after Islamic State militants in Libya released a video on Sunday night.
ISIS is warning ethnic militant who reportedly executed 21
Posiciones de las milicias próximas al Estado Islámico de Libia.
by ISIS's murderous standards. A new video the militants have just released.
Hello there, I'm Barbara Sarah, standing in for Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we've been tracking this week. ISIL Propaganda, the violence of the images and the narrative of revenge. HSBC, Britain's Daily Telegraph, and allegations of ad money influencing the editorial agenda. Which font do you like to read your news in? Helvetica, Times New Roman, maybe Franklin Gothic Condensed? And photographs from the front lines of the news. Since the first ISIL video came online in August 2014, showing the beheading of American journalist James Foley, the group's carefully crafted output has become increasingly gruesome. At the beginning of this month, there was the video of Jordanian pilot Moaz al-Qasasbeh being burnt alive. And then this past week, footage of 21 Egyptian Coptic Christians being beheaded in Libya. It was the first material to be filmed outside ISIL's territories in Syria and Iraq. Each video, each propaganda blast has pulled more and more players into the fray. In the past 3 weeks, Jordan, Egypt, and even New Zealand have joined in. ISIL's output, visual, violent, and compelling, feeds into a narrative of inevitable war and revenge. This is storytelling material made by those who know that beyond the potential recruits, it is global news organizations that will find these images hard to ignore. The Listening Post's Will Young now on ISIL, the spectre of intensifying battle and the propaganda that is defining the latest war in the Middle East. Our starting point this week is Egypt.
Are we now seeing a holy war against Christians?
There's a religious component to this.
He executed 21 kidnapped Egyptians.
Every video that we are getting from the Islamic State is getting more intense, it's getting more dramatic, it's getting more simultaneously compelling and repelling.
Journalists and reporters who want to demonstrate the horrific nature of these actions are caught in a bind.
This is something that comes out of Hollywood almost. And the media recognizes the drama in this, and it's news, it has to be covered.
In the campaign being conducted by the so-called Islamic State, its online videos are powerful media currency. They demand attention, telling a story of revenge, implying dominance on the battlefield, and provoking very real reactions from its enemies.
Well, these videos, I think, are geared towards multiple audiences. On one level, they're geared towards the Western audience and Western publics, and are meant to instill fear and terrorize publics at large. In some instances, drawing them into confrontation. But they're also geared towards potential supporters. They want to be able to communicate that they are here to stay.
We don't want to do anything that contributes to the sort of theatrical nature of the display, because we understand that that is part of the intention of the perpetrators, and of course we don't want to do anything that contributes to that. But at the same time, we're a news organisation. It's our job to report on this and to contextualise it and to explain it, to say, well, look, you know, they're doing this, this is a pattern.
With them or against them.
There is another pattern. A framework within which ISIL, its territorial gains, its professed aims and its propaganda gets covered.
If you're going to be successful in going after them, do it now.
It's a template that was used for Iraq in 2002, for Libya under Gaddafi in 2011,
including military enforcement of a no-fly zone,
and was employed in some quarters for Bashar al-Assad's Syria, until recently when ISIL came into the picture.
The Islamic State's released a video.
Gruesome videos add fuel to the fire. Politicians talk tough, and the media echo and at times amplify that rhetoric. From Japan to Jordan,
نبدأ نشرتنا بالجريمة البشعة والشنيعة التي اقترفتها إصابة داعش الإرهابية
to Egypt.
تحية لأعظم جيش في الدنيا. تحية لجيشنا العظيم.
The case of Egypt's response to the killing of the Egyptian Copts in Libya is an important example of how the media is used by both sides, by ISIL and then by Abdel Fattah Sisi, the president of Egypt, in response to the killings. He's using the media again to show that Egypt is tough and will protect itself and will face any challenge that comes its way. So the media is really central to the way that Sisi tries to shape his perception among the public in Egypt.
So he's been making the case over the past year and a half that the Muslim Brotherhood are practically indistinguishable from some of these other radical jihadist groups. So again, the discourse of you're either with us or against us, and the general sort of narrative of the war on terror. So if you do not support this campaign that is a response to the beheading of 21 Egyptian citizens, then you find yourself in, in opposition to the national security agenda.
إحنا صنعنا داعش. مصر صنعت داعش.
The Egyptian media literally, not only in tandem, but absolutely unanimously stepped forward and said that there needs to be an intervention, perhaps even egging on Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to take action immediately.
Much of the media gravitates naturally toward war metaphors. The framing of war helps us understand difference.
We're going to turn now to the war against ISIS.
It helps us understand resolution, because war obviously gravitates, or should gravitate, towards some kind of decipherable or at least aspirational end.
6 months since the first ISIL video was posted online, audiences have been gripped by the spectacle of violence. In the mainstream media, the anti-terror narrative is being applied to a new battle with a new enemy. An enemy whose propaganda is one of its most powerful weapons.
One of their main strengths is that they can intimidate people, and the media actually does play a role in this. ISIL is very isolated, has a bunch of places where it exists in very small numbers, and when they're fought against with military force, international troops, local troops, they're immediately pushed back. So they're not that strong a military group. The media has to be careful about this.
Well, I think one of the structural problems of this whole story is the way in which it's too often framed as, the West versus terrorists, where it clearly is part of a huge internal battle within the Arab and Muslim world about political change, legitimacy, and so on and so forth. And you see some of that. I think, for example, the Jordanians are quite good at making the point that this has got nothing to do with Islam. These are people who are usurping any sense of legitimacy.
There is a problem in many ways in the media blindly following the calls for intervention, military intervention to defeat ISIL. The media really should analyze much more clearly what actually happens when foreign military intervention takes place in the Middle East. The record of the last 14 years has been pretty dismal in terms of the ability of Western powers to use military force to defeat al-Qaeda and stop the terrorism. Exactly the opposite has happened.
On the download this week, our viewers on the ISIL propaganda battle.
Part of the problem with the media coverage of ISIL is that there's so much emphasis put on the videos that they put out. For example, the beheadings. You find that they're doing 24-hour media coverage on specific cases. And while what ISIL did is horrific, if not horrendous, you're just adding to the PR propaganda machine, and that's exactly what ISIL wants everyone to do.
Fox News, for example, which is a very hawkish, pro-war channel, was the only channel that showed the video of the Jordanian pilot being burned to death in its entirety. And there's a reason for that. The station's ideologues, they want people to be outraged. They want people to support further military efforts against the Islamic State. And meanwhile, the Islamic State looks at this as an opportunity to get more attention.
We're always open to viewer feedback and ideas. If you've got an opinion on the news media, just go to our Facebook or Twitter page. Our Twitter handle is @AJ Listening Post. Fire up the camera, make a worthwhile point, hit send, and we'll see you on the download. Other stories on our radar this week. two media incidents in two neighboring countries, Sudan and South Sudan. On the 16th of February, in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, intelligence and security services stopped the print runs and seized all copies of 14 newspapers. Newspaper seizures have taken place before in Sudan, but this is the first time that so many outlets have been targeted at once. Information Minister Ahmed Bilal Osman said the newspapers were seized in accordance with the law, but gave no reason for the mass confiscations. Local journalists called the raids a massacre on the Sudanese press and protested outside the Press Council. Over in South Sudan, Information Minister Michael Makwei has threatened to shut down media organizations who publish or broadcast interviews with anti-government rebels. The government in Juba has been fighting a civil war with the rebels since the end of 2013, and the warning came off the back of a broadcast by the United Nations-run Miraya FM station that interviewed a senior opposition figure. Makwei said, quote, "If you can go as far as interviewing the rebels to come and disseminate their filthy ideas to the people and poison their minds, that is negative agitation." Similar statements have been made at least twice before, and the minister cautioned media outlets not to ignore the warnings. The chief political commentator of Britain's Daily Telegraph newspaper has resigned over the paper's coverage, or lack of it, of the HSBC tax evasion story. Peter Oborne had been with the London-based broadsheet for 5 years, and he explained his move in a blog post on the Open Democracy website, calling the Telegraph's non-coverage of HSBC a fraud on its readers. Oborne says that distinction between the advertising and editorial departments at the Telegraph had collapsed, and that advertising priorities are allowed to determine editorial judgment. A spokesperson for the Telegraph called Oborne's attack full of inaccuracy and innuendo and said that the paper utterly refutes his allegations. The Guardian, one of the Daily Telegraph's main competitors and a member of the consortium of journalists who broke the HSBC story, has revealed that since the publication of those reports, the bank's advertising with the paper has been on, quote, pause. HSBC is a big player in the UK advertising market. The latest figures indicate they spent £5.1 million across print titles in the first 8 months of 2014. In the Philippines, a radio host has been shot and killed, the second journalist to be murdered there this year. Maurito Lim was the host of a program called Chairman Mao on Board, which aired daily on Radio Ascenso. In his broadcasts, Lim was known to take on local officials with links to the drugs trade. On the morning of February 14th, as Lim was getting into work, he was shot in the head by a gunman who then fled on a motorbike. Local authorities tweeted that CCTV footage from the site of the attack indicates that the murderer was a professional hitman. An investigation is underway, but in the Philippines, chances of the case being solved are slim. According to the Manila-based Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility, 26 journalists have been killed in the country since 2010, when President Benigno Aquino came into office. Despite his pledge to intensify efforts to prosecute crimes against the media, and especially the murders of journalists, only 2 cases have seen resolution since 2010. The way that we consume news can be influenced by the way the information is presented, how it's edited, the choice of images to illustrate the accompanying text, and the choice of typeface itself. Now, for most people, fonts may seem inconsequential, but if you run a newspaper, a TV station, or an online outlet, well, you'd soon realize that the font you choose is key to the message that you want to convey. Because in the process of storytelling, fonts are used to set the tone and project authority. And in a world where news can be agenda-laden and where information is often being framed in a particular way, something as subtle as the choice of a typeface plays a central role in that framing. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the use of fonts in the news media.
Usually when people ask me, what do you do? And I say, I'm a typeface designer. And like, what is that? And like, do we really need more fonts? But yes, because it's the voice and we have different things to say.
Imagine a world where all fonts were the same, where words wore a uniform, where letters spoke in monotone. The local newsstand would look a whole lot duller.
If you go to a newspaper kiosk,
you might see 5 different newspapers there. A person who is just a regular reader, a regular citizen, with no knowledge of newspaper design or typography will be able to tell you, this newspaper is down market. This newspaper is for people perhaps with less education who would like the thrill of murder stories, a little sex, a little of this, a little of that, sensationalism. Then you gravitate towards newspapers like The Guardian in London, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Die Zeit, or the Frankfurter Allgemein in Germany, and all of them in 10 seconds tell you, come here to read. We are serious, gravitas. How do you do that? Without reading one word, typography. In 10 seconds, the typography conveys all kinds of things to people without having read a word.
Here's another way to look at it. Imagine the New York Times masthead changed from NYT Cheltenham to Papyrus, or BBC screen furniture revamped in Hobo, or the Hindu in brush script. Doesn't quite have the same feel to it. That's because fonts don't just house words, they can affect their meaning.
If you look at your regular local newspapers, be it the New York Times, Hindi newspaper, Le Figaro in France, and you presented those newspapers in an unfamiliar typeface, your understanding would be highly confused. It's like you suddenly talking in a different accent, and it might mean I'd be thinking about what you're saying in a very different way. So there's a sort of invisibility to the choice of fonts, and you become used to associating certain kinds of voice with certain kinds of typefaces.
When you pick up a newspaper, when you turn on the TV station, you want to be able to believe what this agency is telling you. So there is that trust factor that you have to build in, and the typefaces have to perform on that subconscious level, so that when you are reading, you are believing.
There are some fonts that provoke more of a reaction than others. A few months back, one of Australia's oldest newspapers did something that had the world of typographers pounding their keyboards. The Sydney Morning Herald published a front-page story in Comic Sans, the font some have called a crime against design. Thousands took to Twitter to scoff at the 183-year-old Daily's design decision. It wouldn't be the first time Comic Sans was the target of the public's wrath. Since its birth 20 years ago, the font has suffered from an almost universal disdain, complete with a campaign to ban it.
Comic Sans, in a sense, I equate it to fashion. I mean, if you see Lady Gaga appearing, some people will think, oh my God, this is the fashion that I would like to wear. And then somebody else would say, my God, who is dressing this woman? Why is she appearing like this? And so it's the same with type. There are people who believe that this is not a font, that this should not be considered typography. I think that there is a place for Comic Sans. And I have never used it myself, but perhaps the opportunity will come for me to use it. Why not?
I think Comic Sans was, you know, some designers are more sensitive to it than others. I don't use it. But it doesn't make me uncomfortable that it exists. I think variety in design is good.
Ever since the 15th century, when a German entrepreneur called Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, which made publishing on a mass scale possible for the first time, typographers have been designing letters and numbers because one font does not fit them all. Today, another revolution is underway, the digital one. Different platforms mean different requirements, and that means different design demands for people who are in a bigger hurry now than they ever were.
Today, we are in the midst of what I call the media quartet. You have the phone, you have the tablet, you have the online, and you have the print. It's 24 hours. It's the journalism of interruptions. People want the news when it's happening. Typography is going to become extremely important in how you present stories in these platforms. And so you have to adapt to interruptions, you have to adapt to quick glances, and bolder type, sans serif type will do better for these glances than type that is a little bit more difficult to tell the difference, the nuances between the letters. So that's a real challenge starting right now.
A challenge for designers creating fonts in Latin script. But for the multitude of countries that rely on calligraphic script, creating standardized, nationally recognized fonts is even more of a challenge. Think of the billion people who get their information in Mandarin, the 260 million who speak Hindi and would read in Devanagari script, 160 million Russians, and 11 million Greeks who read in Cyrillic. In the age of the digital revolution, Latin font may be hegemonic, but it's not representative. And many countries are starved for new typefaces.
Unfortunately, there are other languages where the creation of fonts is minimal. And I'm always interested in seeing how young designers who know that language, type designers, would come and create more fonts, because there are many languages, lesser used languages around the world, where there are not many fonts available for those languages. And that is sad.
One of the big challenges when it comes to Arabic typography, in the Arab world, we have this very rich calligraphic heritage. But then there was this big break, because you jump into our modern times and you look at the digital fonts, and all of a sudden that rich heritage was not properly translated to today's. So the biggest challenge when it came to Arabic fonts is really quantity. That has started to change very recently, because brands have been aware that they need to have a visual, distinct personality as part of their branding.
What's happening in the world right now, and it's affecting our languages and the way we speak and the way we design our languages, is that it's becoming globally generic. When it becomes globally generic, you lose local complexity. And in fact, it's the interest of broad generics to replace local complexity. So I think the real challenge for us is to preserve that, to look for what heritage has led to a certain kind of language, and go back and try and reinforce and capture that.
Because it's not just in the content of words that meaning is generated, it's also in their form. And although good journalism is ultimately about the facts, it's not just the literal meaning of the words that convey the truth.
More voices on the download now on fonts and how to use them.
The choice of fonts in a news publication is probably the most important decision to make. It will not only bind the corporate identity together, but it is also the main tool that the publication uses to communicate with the readers. So the fonts are making a statement even before you start reading the news. The fonts are saying, I am this kind of publication.
The choice of typeface by a publication does affect the experience of its readers. It makes a big difference towards how easy it is to read, as well as the credibility they have to the audience. There probably isn't a single good news font. Picking one is usually a product of the sort of constraints they might have, such as whether it's a digital or print publication, type of content, as well as kind of image that they're trying to portray to the audience.
And finally, every year, the Netherlands-based World Press Photo Awards selects some of the best photographs chronicling the year gone by. It's just announced the winners for 2014, and flipping through the images gives you a great retrospective of the big news of last year. Some stories are easy to spot, like the Ebola outbreak. Others are hidden in more subtle photographs, like the image of the unworn uniforms of the missing schoolgirls from Chibok in Nigeria. The winner across all categories this year has been taken by Danish photographer Mads Nissen, showing a gay couple in Russia. Well, we're going to close the show with a compilation of a few of our favorite pictures, and we'll see you next time at The Listening Post.